A historic judgment has been passed down in the Constitutional Court after lawmakers confirmed that the current Electoral Act was unconstitutional due to its existing frameworks. Meanwhile, the ANC and EFF have agreed on the proposed postponement of next year's local government elections as proposed by the Electoral Committee of South Africa. The two parties have also agreed that the country's elections should be consolidated with national, provincial and local government elections all held in the same year. Political analyst and governance expert Ebrahim Fakir joins us now to discuss both these matters. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Fakir. Let me first start with the government's prospects of appealing this ruling, the Constitutional Court ruling. What are your thoughts there? What's your sense? Is it something that's plausible?
So it all depends on whether the parties believe that they would like to appeal this. I think there would be grounds for appeal. Otherwise, the Constitutional Court would not have said that they are allowing the appeal. Of course, they would need to appeal, but they would need to craft their appeal on the basis of trying to raise objections on what they think has not been adequately considered at the current in the current judgment. However, the prospects of that, if they bring in new arguments, they may fly, but everything is going to depend on what they craft their arguments on. Now, I think it may be possible. I suspect that the reading of Section 19, particularly subsection 3, has been quite specific and quite narrow and quite literal. It may have an impact on the question of the direct election of president. It may not. Perhaps I'm reading too much into it. But the reality is that it seems as if the way in which the judgment is crafted is seeming to suggest that the idea of a office, contesting for office, of course in the National Assembly and provincial legislatures, is one hurdle or one mechanism which should be done away with. And the mechanism that will be done away with is having to be part of an organization or party. Now, we know that there is a second mechanism that is required in order to be elected president or to some other executive office. That is that you must first be elected into the National Assembly or into a provincial legislature before you become president or premier, respectively. Now, of course, the argument might well be that because you are already elected, we've tested you as an individual, you are elected now as a member of the National Assembly, and therefore you would be eligible to be a president. The question then is that extrication of the president, because remember the president ceases to be a member of the National Assembly. Does that conceive of the office of the president as separate and therefore an office which ought to be contestable on the basis of Section 19 if every individual is entitled to contest for office? But of course that would be some abstracted legal argument would have to be made on that basis. There may be other bases on which the argument or an appeal can be crafted. For example, the appeal to sections that talk about the local government election, and the court judgment says that they suggest that a mixed system, including constituencies, should be considered. But that section doesn't actually say so. It says that it's contingent if the subordinate legislation or the Electoral Act puts in constituencies. Then it might consider it, but even then the result must be proportional. So there are grounds for appeal, but of course that depends on whether the parties want to appeal.
Mr. Fakir, let me just stop you there on the issue of constituency-based representation. How important is it for our democracy?
I think it is important in the sense that it creates the potential for greater responsiveness. Greater responsiveness in the sense that now elected representatives are dependent on that constituency to be elected, not necessarily on the party bosses. And so therefore it does weaken the party bosses a little bit. However, think about the fact that we do have directly elected representatives at local government level in wards or constituencies, if you will. And they aren't terribly responsive or terribly accountable. Some people say you might improve accountability. I'm not sure that argument always holds water either, simply because if you think about the level of accountability of directly elected representatives, it's relatively weak, firstly. Secondly, much of our accountability problems stem from impunity, not necessarily from the design of the electoral system. I have no illusions that the electoral system change will necessarily by definition, include accountability. It does bear the potential. I think many of us have argued that a mixed system at national and provincial level may, in fact, be vital to improve, at least systemically, the chance for better accountability and better responsiveness. But part of that has to be done through the political cultures in political parties, but also in society.
The EFF saying that, if anything, that COVID-19 has shown us is that there really is no need for so many elections. Just speaking on the whole issue of consolidating the elections, having one super election in 2024. What would be the impact of the balance of power politically if this arrangement does come to pass? And how would it impact on things like planning, budgetary constraints, etc., etc.?
Well, there are many impacts, but let's just think about the political impact first before we come to the practical administrative ones. Now, if you think about any move away from a constituency system, and you think at the national and provincial level of any of the parties from the third party down, including the EFF, they are highly dependent on aggregation of support across society in a PR system, rather than concentrated, geographic, defined areas of support which will get them elected into seats in defined constituencies. Of course, everything depends on how big or small the constituencies are drawn, how many constituencies you're going to have, and so on. But for many of the smaller parties, a move away from a PR system at least induces some kind of existential crisis for them. Of course, they'll retain a fair number of seats, but there's a greater chance that they lose the number of seats that they've got now than they would in a pure PR system. So that's the political impact. The administrative impact are multiple. You see, so the idea that you have all of the elections at once and it saves you costs, that may be true, but you are compounding not just the administrative costs for the IEC, but you are also compounding the cost of consolidating issues, because the issues at local government are fairly distinct and separate than they are at national level. That's the first. So there's a question of issues. The second is campaigning. You will then fudge all of the issues that are local and fudge them under the cover of national issues. The third is the reason you have periodic elections is because elections are not just a technical exercise to test how much support a party can have. It is also a social solidarity exercise. It brings people together. It's an instant of participation. So the more elections you have, the more instances of participation in bringing people together that you have. Administratively, when you have all of the elections on one day, you also create massive administrative burdens for the IEC, not just in planning and processing, so the different kind of ballot papers, the balloting materials, the staff, and so on. But now think about the counting processes. You're now having to deal with 3 or 4 or 5 different elections, and you have to count them all on one day. It creates greater potential for conflict. It creates greater flashpoints for conflict rather than reducing them. It reduces the number of instances of participation, and the marginal costs that you might engage in terms of saving is too much of a cost at the expense of participation, of regularity, of frequency of elections, of routinizing participation in democratic
Fakir, let me
government.
just ask one final question, if you can, very briefly, and I know it's a big question to ask. Then it brings about the issue of alternative voting. We know that we've been working on electronic voting, for instance, as an option. How would that impact the credibility of the vote, introducing various ways of alternative voting, meaning also doing away with municipal elections and rather having by-elections?
Well, by-elections are separate, but the idea that you're going to move away from paper-based ballots and so on is an idea which has taken root in many other parts of the world. However, the level of trust politically, institutionally, and process-wise needs to be high, that the system has integrity, the administrators and the managers and the IT technicians and everyone else involved in the process are not going to cook the process. Let's just be frank. Our politicians have very low trust amongst themselves and amongst each other. Societal trust in institutions and processes of government is plummeted. Institutional trust in the IEC may be high, But the political parties are incredibly skeptical of any kind of electronic voting. Why? Because they believe the system can be fudged, and many of the oversight and transparency be done away with when you have electronic voting. So I don't think that it is an option until and unless the politicians sit down, put the public interest before their own, and trust a system of electronic voting that might in fact work.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. Political analyst and governance expert Ebrahim Fakir. We're going to take a quick break. Do stay with us.